Hi everyone, this is section 1.6 on applications and modeling, and let's take a second to talk about those two words. So first of all, it's real common in a math book to go through a chapter or a module, whatever they call them. You learn a bunch of stuff, and then the very last section of that module is on word problems. Now, the two words that from the title of this section, those are basically ways of saying word problems. So if you say you're going to do applications, what it means is we're going to take what we've learned in the rest of this chapter and we are going to apply it to real life situations. And that's basically a word problem. Now the other one, modeling. A mathematical model is when you take a word problem or a real life situation and you create a model for it or an equation to solve it. So applications and modeling, when you're in a math class, I just want you to be aware that those two words mean we're doing real life situations or word problems. So let's talk about general rules for solving a word problem. This is going to be like, for as long as you take math, you're always going to see word problems. So here are some general rules for solving them. Number one, always read the entire question before you do anything. It's a common mistake people make is they'll start reading a question, they'll read the first sentence, they'll be like, oh, okay, I'm going to do this, and they'll start writing. Or they see the first number, there are $1,000. They go, okay, $1,000, and they start, read the question once through, just put your pencil down, read through the whole thing once because you get the idea of the question, what you're being asked to do, things like that. Then you go back and try to solve it. Number two, always name your variables. If the question says, how much does something cost, right? X equals price of this thing. If the question says, whatever you're being asked, how many oranges did so-and-so buy? You write X equals number of oranges. Name that variable, declare what you don't know and what you're trying to find in the question. Number three, draw a picture. And I said if one is needed. Not every word problem needs a picture, but a lot of them do. And if you need that picture and it's not already there in the question, draw it out. That's going to help you. Number four, create a strategy for solving for your variable. So in number two, you said, okay, X is the price of something. How are you going to solve for X? What's your strategy? Am I going to, take the number of things I sold and multiply it by the price? Just come up with like a verbal model, a strategy. Now I said that might mean writing an equation. It doesn't always, but it could. Now once you've done those four things, you're ready to solve. So you go back, you take your strategy, you do it, you solve for that variable from number two, and that's the answer to your question. But what you don't want to do is just read the question or read half the question and just jump in and start doing things. I'm going to multiply this number, I'm going to do this. Make a strategy first, follow that strategy, solve for your variable. So here's a quick and fairly simple example of a word problem. I said 3 friends are taking a road trip and want to split the driving evenly. If the whole trip is 172 miles, how far should each person drive? So I don't need a picture for this one. I read the question, I understand it. 3 people are going to split driving evenly. So I think, all right, well, let's, maybe name your variable. X is how far each person should drive. That's what we're trying to find. And then I come up with a strategy. And then, like I said, you don't need an equation for this one. This is actually a kind of an overly simplified example for us to start with. My strategy would be if 3 people are taking a road trip and they want to split the driving evenly, let's take the total distance and divide it by 3. And I'm actually going to write that out. This is my strategy. I'm going to take the total distance and divide it by 3. Well, the total distance, it says in the question, is 172 miles. So I'm going to take my 172, I'm going to divide it by 3. All right. Now, when I do that, I haven't done it yet, but when I do that, maybe you grab a calculator, type 172 divided by 3. You're going to get your answer. But in this case, the answer is going to come out to a decimal. And that happens a lot in a word problem. And we want to talk about what to do. Do we leave it as a decimal? Do we round it? What do we do in that situation? So let's talk about this answer a little bit. The answer to the question was exactly what we said earlier. It's 172 divided by 3. But when I do that on a calculator, I get a repeating decimal. I type it in, it says 57.33333, and the 3's just keep going forever. So what should I put for my answer? And it kind of depends on the question. There is no one right answer to this question. I can't say every single time you should do exactly this. It kind of depends on the question. So here are some choices. Do I round off to the nearest mile? And I'd say each person is going to say drive 57 miles. Do I round off to one decimal place? Say each person is going to drive 57.3 miles. Do I write the whole thing? Do I write 57 and just write a whole bunch of 3's on my paper? Do I use fractions? 57 point repeating 3 is actually 57 1/3 miles. So you have a lot of choices. It depends on the question. So the first thing you always want to do is look back at the question. I didn't put anything in it this time, but sometimes it might say something like round your answer to the nearest mile. And then the answer would be 57. Or it might say round to the nearest tenth of a mile. Then the answer is 57.3. It might say give an exact answer. And we'll talk about that in a second. So if you want the exact answer to a question, use fractions. The exact answer to that question was 57 1/3 mile. Even if you write a whole bunch of 3's, you can write 57 point and then write the number 3 100 times. It's still not exact. It's still rounded off because that's a repeating 3 forever. Now, we don't often in word problems want exact answers. Sometimes we want approximations, so you can round off. Now, as I mentioned earlier, always check the question first. If it tells you directly to round, then do that. If it says round to the nearest mile, the answer is 57. If it says round to the nearest tenth, it's 57.3. Now, a lot of questions don't give you specific directions, and I always tell students, do what you think is reasonable. You want to get a fairly accurate answer, but not so accurate that it's unreasonable. I mean, if you were planning a trip with your friends, you wouldn't say to your friend, hey, I want you to drive 57.333333333 miles. That's not reasonable. But you could say, yeah, we're each going to drive about 57 miles. Or 57.3 miles. Things like that are reasonable. I think for the last question, 57.3 miles would be a good answer. That's what's reasonable to me. I think it shows me as the teacher and as the grader that you did the work right and you got the right answer, but it's not ridiculous. It's not 57.3333333. And of course, if you said 57 1/3, I wouldn't mark that wrong. That's actually a better answer. That's the exact answer, but it's not going to come from a calculator. Most calculators don't do fractions, they do decimals. So you get the idea. When we start talking about modeling or applications, part of the question is doing the work and getting the answer. But part of the question is also answering, telling me the answer. What do I say? And again, one more time, always check the question for directions. If it tells you to do something, do that. If it says round to the nearest mile, then definitely round to the nearest mile. If it doesn't say anything, just be reasonable.